Hello, Politics Plus Media 101 listeners. Justin and I are very pleased to be joined here by Greg Poling. This is our third time hosting Greg. Greg is a senior fellow at CSIS, the Center for Strategic International Studies, and he's also the director of the Southeast Asia Program and the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative. So Greg, for the purpose of this program, is a particularly relevant person to talk to because we are talking about the Shangri-La Dialogue, the event that was held recently in Singapore, and Greg was there in person at the event. We're going to be talking about the event and its purpose and the takeaways, and we're going to be looking in particular through the prism, I think, of Southeast Asia, because that's Greg's wheelhouse, and it's such a relevant region for this new era of U.S.-China competition. So, Greg, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me back, guys. And John, I appreciate you reading out the whole title. That's like the most inflated DC title one could imagine.
Well, I mean, look, that's what it says on the website, Greg. So, I mean, if I was to abridge it anyway, I'd be taking liberty that would be inappropriate. Greg, let's start by telling us what the Shangri-La Dialogue is. What's the event? What's the purpose? Who are the participants? I think most of the listeners probably don't know much about it. So tell us what we need to know.
So the Shangri-La Dialogue it's been going for 20 years now. It's run by IISS, which is another word soup think tank. This one based in London, the International Institute for Strategic Studies. They approached the government of Singapore 20 years back and pitched the idea that they could set up a track 1.5, so both official government and non-government folks, purely defense, right? So they only want defense ministers and their equivalents, and then defense experts, grand strategists on the track 2 side. And so over the last 20 years, it's really become the annual venue where all of these defense ministers and defense secretaries come and they make their speeches. It's kind of like the analog to the Munich Security Conference, which is the European equivalent. Or more recently, there's another that happens in Bahrain. So you kind of got 3 of these now on the calendar every year.
Leaders and officials from more than 40 countries have begun arriving here in Singapore for Asia's highest-level defense summit. The Shangri-La Dialogue this year is also expected to see more representatives from Europe compared to last year. It's an opportunity for them to talk through and resolve challenging security issues that mostly affect this region. Now, at the same time, defense deals are being inked.
So, Greg, you look like a young guy, so I assume you haven't been attending for 20 years. How long have you been attending, and what do you learn from being in person as opposed to reading readouts or watching it on video?
Yeah, so I have not been going for 20 years. I think the first one I went to was 2018 or 19, and had been watching from afar for a couple of years before that. I'd actually contributed to the publication that they put out every year, which is probably what got me my ticket to the first one. Like the year after, you write for them for free, and then they'll let you come in. And then, of course, COVID shut things down. So this was the first time I'd been back in 4 years or so. Honestly, you don't get anything from the speeches, so you couldn't get from watching them on YouTube or in the U.S. case, reading the DoD transcript of Secretary Austin's speech. There are sideline events that are not filmed, but those are also, you get the similar discussions in DC. The real reason people go is because you network with kind of all the people that you might see over the course of a year on the conference circuit. You get them all there for 2 days. And it's a very interesting discussion. There's also a very interesting kind of meta-analysis that goes on involving the track 1 delegations that come. So people sit there and say, "Oh, how many participants came from China this year compared to last year, and did they ask questions, and what kind of questions, and so what were they trying to message?" So there's this weird Shangri-La dialogueology that goes on every year.
So, Greg, I've gone to some of these sorts of conferences, like in Dubai, the television media conference, and for Justin, I think he's probably got some traumatic memories of the Republican National Convention. Can you tell us a little bit about what the day is like there as an attendee? Is it like, you go and you have a cold cafeteria breakfast, and then you have an hour of networking, a couple panels, and then a social event at night? I mean, what's kind of the texture? Is it in a big hotel conference room, or is it in more of a big convention center? What's it like kind of on a daily basis as an attendee?
So it is in swanky digs because it's the Shangri-La Dialogue. So it's formally co-branded between IISS and the Shangri-La Hotel, which is a luxury hotel brand, particularly in Asia. So it's in a very nice hotel conference room. It's not like your Marriott by the airport, but I mean, it's still a conference room. The nicest hotel conference room is still a hotel conference room. So you walk in, you go through the metal detectors, and have to deal with the security because, of course, there's so many secretaries and a few heads of state there. But then once you're back there, you're mostly just going from long keynote to quick coffee break to next long keynote. So it is a very long day for those who attend all of it. The whole thing lasts. There's an opening dinner, which is usually where you get the big keynote. This year it was the Australian Prime Minister. Then you have a full day of keynotes on the first day and then a half day on the second. And the fireworks, they usually now put the U.S. secretary first on day one and the Chinese secretary first or minister first on day two. So that's when the room's really packed.
And Greg, you're talking about all the eyes on the attendees, on the delegations. And I've been looking a little bit into the countries that do participate in the dialogue, and I'm seeing some controversial countries. And I know that Munich dealt with this in a certain way. I'm sure Bahrain has dealt with it in their own way. But I'm interested in how IISS and Singapore deal with these kind of pariah states. I'm thinking of Myanmar, who are a big part of the region, and there's always been this delicacy around, do we treat the junta as a proper delegation of the country? I see Russia on the map of countries that have participated in the past. What's the approach to these controversial kind of pariah states that have a status that's sometimes not acknowledged by people who are attending? Do they have a proper seat at the table the way they always have, or is there a different approach that's been taken to these countries?
Well, look, I can't speak for what IISS internal decision making's like. They're in a tough spot, as any independent institute would be that's trying to hold one of these things where the explicit point of the dialogue is to provide a venue to have difficult conversation. Right? It's a place where the Chinese defense minister and the American Secretary of Defense can one, message publicly, but then meet on the sidelines quietly for some kind of track, which didn't happen this year, but it happens most years. So you don't want to be too quick to close the door on those difficult issues. But I mean, there is a line. And so this year there was no official Burmese Myanmar delegation. There were participants from Myanmar, but they were all academics based in exile outside of the country. There were no Russian delegates this year. There was the Ukrainian defense minister. I mean, so IISS made decisions this year. And I'm sure that they'll have to continue to make these tough calls. I think at the end of the day, your decision is, does having them there produce anything of value, right? Is it going to be productive? And is it going to be productive to have the Burmese junta there? No, absolutely not. So it's all downside risk.
So with the wide range of views that are represented at this dialogue and conference, I guess, does anything get done? And that may not be the right way to frame this. In addition to the side dialogues that you mentioned, the back channeling, the networking, which is all very valuable, the transference of ideas through the keynotes and the dinners and everything of the sort. Is there ever a consensus formed on topics that may surprise attendees like you? Or are we going in there and kind of understanding what everybody's line is going to be, and people generally toe the company line? How can we understand what productive means?
So the productive stuff happens in the track one sideline meetings, which, of course, the rest of the attendees are invited to. We read about it in the newspapers like everybody else. This year that was hoped to be an Austin-Li Shangfu meeting. So Secretary Austin with the Chinese defense minister who just took office. That didn't happen. That has happened in previous years. But there were other productive sideline meetings. There was the first ever U.S., Japan, Australia, Philippine defense secretaries meeting on the sidelines, which is the new Quad, or I don't want to call it the Quad, but, the networking of the four alliances. You had a lot of bilateral meetings, not just with the Americans, with the Aussies, the Japanese, and of course with the Chinese too. So there's a lot of activity that goes on, a lot of MOUs get signed, etc. Same as you get on the sidelines of like the UN General Assembly or the APEC meetings. Any of these excuses where a lot of officials are going to be in town anyway. You do a lot of other yeoman's work. The public stuff, I mean, look, it ultimately, at least for the last few years, whatever IISS and the government of Singapore originally envisioned, it has become a messaging battle between the Americans and the Chinese. That's primarily how the press covers it, and so that's primarily how it gets viewed by everybody except for the 300 of us who happen to be in the room, right? And this year, like I'd argue the last couple in person, the Americans probably got the better of it, but it's a pretty hostile environment for the Chinese, and they know that going in. So they're not necessarily trying to win hearts and minds. They're just trying to lay down some firm red lines.
So in this messaging battle, I guess the most powerful tool that we have would be Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austins' speech. Can you get into what his speech was focusing on and if there were any surprises, or what you think the most important aspects of that speech were?
Yeah. So look, let me start with this. Last year, his speech basically had one theme. It was his first speech ever at Shangri-La, and his speech was about law, international law, sovereignty, rules-based order, right? So it was going after both China and Russia for violations of the sovereignty of their smaller neighbors and arguing that the U.S. and its allies and partners, NATO, Japan, etc., were the defenders of that rules-based order in the face of revisionist threats. And he did a very good job of packaging that in a way that was attractive to the audience by basically quoting Asian leaders. So he wouldn't say, this is what America thinks. He would say, this is what the Prime Minister of Singapore said on X. This is what the President of Korea says. So he was able to spin this narrative that the U.S. was actually responding to demand signals from smaller countries, not pushing its will on anybody. And then his Chinese counterpart took over the next day and just gave this like strident, chest thumping speech about the South China Sea and Taiwan. It really did not resonate. This year, you saw a redux of that with a couple of changes. So the first third of Austin's speech was basically the same speech as last year. Then the middle third was kind of a victory lap for all the progress that the Biden administration has made with deepening the alliances with Japan, Australia, the AUKUS deal with the Aussies in the UK, huge strides in the Philippine alliance. So we had a lot more deliverables to talk about than he did last year. And then the last third is the most important, at least for kind of setting the narrative. That was a bit about the need for communication with the Chinese. And he was able to use the fact that Li Shangfu, the new Chinese defense minister, refused a meeting. And now the Chinese will say that they have reasons for that. Li Shangfu has been sanctioned by the American government for his role in purchases of Russian arms. So they're going to say, well, we're not going to, you're sanctioning our guy, but then you complain that we don't want to meet with you. But in any case, Austin was able to do a very good job saying, we're having all of these unsafe air intercepts. A couple hours after he spoke, you had a near collision in the Taiwan Strait between a U.S. and a Chinese vessel, and he was able to paint the Chinese side as being reckless by refusing to talk. And that really put Li Shangfu on the back foot when he came out in day two. He was a slightly more charismatic, more personable defense minister than his predecessor, but he still had to deliver the same chest-thumping language about Taiwan and the South China Sea and sovereignty, and it went over rather poorly because of the way Austin had set the table.
At a security summit in Singapore, Defense Minister Li Shangfu outlines China's position and issues a warning.
In essence, attempts to push for a NATO-like alliance in the Asia-Pacific is a way of holding regional countries hostage and heightening confrontation, which will only cause disputes and plunge the region into conflict.
How did Austin's speech go over?
So the consensus among the folks in the room, and I assume it's shared by those who at least watched the YouTube video, is that Austin's a pretty effective speaker when it comes to reading off the teleprompter and delivering these lines. He does a very good job at that. He's a little weaker on Q&A. He was pretty roundly thumped last year for not really being able to answer the questions. And in his defense, he had never worked Asia really in any way before that. Right? I mean, he was brought to that job to get us out of Afghanistan, and he was still learning all this other stuff. This year he did better. Still a little weak on some of the Q&A, but that's not the part that most of the press picks up on. That doesn't make it into most of the nightly news broadcasts. So overall, it was a pretty well-received speech, and it's a pretty friendly audience for him because it's not just Asian officials. It's also a pretty heavy contingent of Europeans, Canadians, Aussies.
We are determined to maintain peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. And so are a number of countries around the world, and that number continues to grow. President Biden has been clear. The United States does not seek a new Cold War, and competition must not spill over into conflict.
Greg, the way that you described Lloyd Austins' approach in his speech, where he starts off by quoting not American officials, but Asian leaders and saying, this is what the South Korean leader said, this is what the Singaporean leader said. It's a really interesting approach because it suggests this kind of consensus, but it's also risky, isn't it? Because there's the chance that he's seen to be putting words in the mouth of other leaders and overstating their alignment with the U.S. position on China, right?
I think he does he did at least last year and so far this year, a reasonably good job of keeping the focus narrow and, places where nobody can really argue. So, for instance, able to quote the Singaporeans last year on Russia, where the Singaporeans came out very hard and said, look, if this can happen to Ukraine, it can certainly happen to a country as small as us. And so this is existential for all small, medium-sized countries. And that resonates more than the Americans making the argument, because particularly in parts of Southeast Asia and the global South in general, you do still have the narrative having some cachet that this is NATO's fault, or at least partially NATO's fault. And that disappears if you can quote a Singaporean leader saying that. On the China stuff, it's useful to be able to say, as our friends in Seoul and Tokyo and Manila, because they're the ones on the receiving end of all of this pressure on sovereignty and maritime issues. It's not going to resonate with everybody. It becomes a bit of a Rorschach test, right? Those parts of the audience who are already predisposed to assume the Americans are causing trouble, they're not going to have their minds changed. But overall, I think it's pretty effective. It's a pretty effective way, at least for those on the fence, to not feel like the Americans are coming in and setting the terms of the conversation.
And just hearing you and then John describe it again, how they take this approach of using other folks' words to resonate more strongly with the audience. It brings me back to my time at the RNC, because this is a fundamental approach to effective opposition research. If you make your points through other people's language, it's very hard to rebut them or go against them. So that's just bringing it back to some domestic politics. But pivoting a little bit, you've mentioned Ukraine a couple times. How did Ukraine factor into this event, especially considering how China and the U.S. have been at loggerheads for a variety of reasons over the conflict in Ukraine?
The audience, again, it's more sympathetic to the Ukrainian cause and kind of the U.S. and NATO line than some other audience in Asia would be, given how many Europeans and as well as other, Japanese, Australians, Canadians are there. There was a lot of European representation on the stage. So you had the Prime Minister of Estonia, the Defense Secretary of Germany. There was a lot of very firm language. We had the Defense Minister of Sweden talking about Sweden's bid for NATO accession. And then you put that on top of the Americans, the Japanese, the Koreans, the Aussies, the Canadians. So the vast majority of those speakers, both in and out of Asia, were pretty sympathetic to Ukraine. And the Russians were not there to rebut any of it, which wouldn't have gone over well anyway. The only weird moment you had was when the Indonesian defense minister, Prabowo Subianto, came out and on the fly laid out his own peace plan for Ukraine during his keynote, which was not in his prepared remarks and has gotten him in a bit of hot water back in Indonesia, because he basically said we should freeze the conflict where it is now, before the Ukrainians really start the spring offensive rolling, establish a demilitarized zone, and then hold referenda in the occupied territories. And which you could just feel the whole audience pull back when he said that. And then they asked the defense minister of Ukraine, sitting in the front row. He's caught on camera afterwards saying, "What do you think of Prabowo's plan?" He said it sounded like it came out of Moscow. So it did not play well for Prabowo, and nobody else attempted it. I'll say the Chinese were careful about this. They didn't defend the Russians explicitly in any sense, either when the defense minister spoke or during their various interjections in every panel from the audience. They did go after NATO in the abstract quite hard. They talk about NATO expansion and, setting up an Asian NATO, and it was clearly implied what they were getting at.
Greg, you're an expert on the ASEAN countries, the 10 countries in Southeast Asia. You talked about how the Indonesian delegation put forward kind of a dead-on arrival idea for Ukraine peace. not going to move the needle on the conflict. What are other ways in which the ASEAN countries are playing a role on the Ukraine conflict? Is there economic or defense matters in which they are actually playing a tangible part in the story?
Well, they are. And look, the Indonesians, this was Prabowo going rogue, and it was not representative of any official Indonesian position. Last year, Indonesia was the host of the Group of 20. And you might remember President Joko Widodo of Indonesia was the first Asian leader to go visit both Kyiv and Moscow and try to broker, some kind of deal. And it did lend some more momentum to the Black Sea Grain Initiative. And then just before the G20 summit, which was held in Bali, Indonesia in November, you might remember like a week before that, the Black Sea grain deal expired, and it looked like the Russians might not be willing to renew it. At the last minute, Putin decided not to go to the G20, but Lavrov did. And it seems likely that Indonesian pressure on this front, where the Indonesians were really going out saying this is about food security. I mean, they had some of the highest vegetable oil prices in the world. They, like the rest of the global south, were facing real food crunches late last year, along with energy price volatility. That might have helped, on the margins, keep the grain deal alive. You've mostly heard Southeast Asian states follow that line. They don't want to take a hard position one way or another on the political issue here, but they are increasingly worried about the direct impact of rising food and energy prices on their own development. The one exception to that so I will say most of the Southeast Asians have voted for the first two, at least, UN resolutions. So they haven't been completely on the fence. But the only one who's been proactively supporting sanctions is Singapore. And the Singaporeans came out hard at the beginning, kind of like cutting against their own public opinion a bit, taking a firm stand that this was unacceptable. And their government seems to have messaged it well enough that now the Singaporean public has caught on and is on board with a pretty tough line on Russia.
Singapore is a staunch supporter of international law and the UN Charter, which prohibits acts of aggression against a sovereign state. And that's why we've strongly condemned the unprovoked attack by Russia on Ukraine. The sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity of all countries, big and small, must be respected. The unprovoked military invasion of a sovereign country under any pretext is unacceptable.
So, Greg, Singapore, even though they're a small country geographically, they're an economic power. They're the basis for a huge kind of financial hub, right? So Singapore joining the sanctions, what does that mean practically for the war? I mean, how much impact can that have?
Yeah, look, it's marginal, but I mean, so is every other single country that's not the United States probably that joins the sanctions. You spackle this together piece by piece by piece. Singapore does play a major role in global financial markets, with kind of the slow death of Hong Kong as a financial sector. Singapore has clearly emerged as the foremost financial hub in Asia. It's also a huge hub when it comes to fuel mixing, refinement, and export. And they haven't been perfect on this, but you have had a lot of pressure on the Singaporeans to help limit the amount of fuel mixing and re-export of Russian fuel to get around the price caps. So Singapore matters here. They matter modestly, but so does pretty much everybody else.
So I'll follow up with kind of getting into the US-China dynamics at the conference. How did the crowd react to the different presentations? Were there any outbursts or interruptions or anything of note?
No real outbursts. I mean, it's a pretty well-behaved crowd, or they wouldn't get invited back. So when Secretary Austin spoke, the Q&A afterwards was pretty good to him. I mean, you didn't get anybody really yelling. Of course, you got the Chinese question, which was pointed, but he dodged it. Quick aside here, I should note that the Chinese delegation was about 30, I think, participants, biggest they've ever sent. But I believe 28 of them were uniformed military. There was one academic who was based in Singapore, and I think one independent Chinese academic who came from China. The Chinese military officers split up to make sure that they were in every session, even the sideline sessions. And at least in the sessions I was in, they asked a question in every keynote and every session. And they're the only uniformed military officers who do that. The Americans don't. None of the other militaries ask questions. So the Chinese have a very like concerted counter messaging effort in every single panel because they know that the panels are going to be pretty hostile to their worldview. So you had that as a through line throughout every time, no matter what the topic was. You knew there was going to be kind of a hostile pointed question from the Chinese delegation. Beyond that, you didn't get much of that. And after Defense Minister Li Shangfu spoke on Sunday, the questions were almost universally hostile. He got questions from the deputy commander of the Philippine Coast Guard, and then a Vietnamese academic, an Indonesian academic. And as you'd expect, they were all like, you just said that China never threatens its neighbors, but, why do you keep ramming into us in the South China Sea? That's basically the through line. And he just ignores the question.
This is a little bit of the back end machinations, but China took this approach, like you're mentioning, 28 military officers, ensuring that they're in all the side sessions asking questions. Do we know if the U.S. takes a strategic approach to these conferences, works with our allies, and pre-plans how we're going to do questions so that it's not only us asking tough questions, but our friends and partners? I'm just wondering if there's any back-end coordination that we would know about.
There's not. I mean, I can confidently say there's not because, again, no official, certainly no military official from any other country asked a question. And I don't remember anybody asking a question at the last in-person Shangri-La, at least the last time I attended. I mean, the military officials just do not see that as their role, except for the Chinese. They are there to take part in the various sideline, official meetings that happen. Otherwise, they are wallflowers during the public sections of the event, with the exception of the principal, the secretary. He's the only one that speaks. Nobody else speaks from the official side. So the American delegation, if you look at IISS's like app they put out, was larger than the Chinese, but it was almost entirely civilian. I mean, yes, there were officials traveling with the delegation, but those who actually took part in the plenary were all academics and think tankers and the like. And none, nobody called me and asked what I'm going to ask. I don't know of any other American participant who got a call and said, would you please ask this or would you please ask that? So it's kind of two different events depending on if you're in the Chinese delegation or any of the other groups.
Greg, they must have just left you off the WhatsApp group as they were coordinating all of the questions, or they had your wrong number.
Yeah, you say that, but I mean, one of the best parts about being in the audience is you get into the WhatsApp groups. And pro tip, if you're going to be at Shangri-La, make sure you're in a WhatsApp group with a lot of Vietnamese and Indian participants in particular, and Filipinos, because the Chinese speech, without fail, always includes the same line where they say, unlike other countries, China has never threatened its neighbors, has never engaged in wars of aggression. And that's the moment when your WhatsApp group just lights up with emojis, rolling eyes, and, because, of course, the Vietnamese and the Filipinos and the Indians, it's all they can do not to laugh out loud when that line comes up.
This is what the Chinese are missing by using, WeChat instead of WhatsApp, because otherwise they'd realize that everyone was laughing at them when they give this speech. But Greg, it's kind of interesting to me that you're describing the kind of combative, boisterous approach that the Chinese delegation were taking, because it reminds me of what we talked about a few years ago, the wolf warrior diplomacy, named after that infamously terrible movie that made a couple $1 billion in China, Wolf Warrior 2. The idea that the Chinese diplomats would take this really kind of aggressive posture in all of their communication. And I thought that I heard last year that they were trying to move back off of that stuff. Are they back to Wolf Warrior, Greg? Or did they never leave?
No, certainly the Wolf Warriorism has diminished. And it's not clear that this was ever a concerted, centralized effort. What happened, you've always had this aspect of Chinese diplomacy, particularly through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which is relatively weak within the system. They're not like our, Department of State. They're bit players in Chinese decision making. All the real stuff happens in the party. So Chinese diplomats who work out in the embassies, they spend as much time messaging the home base as they do trying to actually do the work of diplomats in their country. And that got, I think, accelerated. It got amplified during COVID because mean, one, you had a handful of diplomats, former DCM to Pakistan being the most famous example, who then he was the foremost wolf warrior on Twitter, got promoted to be the spokesperson for the MFA, and then I think it was moved over to a deputy minister or something in the state oceanic administration. So people see something like that at a time when China had turned completely insular during COVID, right? I mean, couldn't have cared less what the rest of the world thought about them or was saying. And so you had all these junior diplomats who decided the way to get promoted was to be the most ridiculous, the most aggressive on social media. And that paid off for a while. And then as China began to open from COVID, particularly after the Party Congress late last year and the end of zero COVID, you've seen a tighter leash put on them. It still happens. The ambassador to France being a good example, who got into some hot water. And recently, the ambassador to the Philippines basically threatened all Filipino overseas workers living in Taiwan. So that stuff still happens. But it doesn't seem to be rewarded institutionally the way it was in the middle of COVID.
Clownish social media behavior as a way to get promoted. It sounds like the way it works in some parts of the American political system, but maybe not in the civil service diplomatic corps. Greg, as we were preparing for this discussion, I was looking over some stuff about our standing in ASEAN, our relative standing, and I saw this report that was published by the Lowry Institute that ranked U.S. versus China on 4 categories. It was diplomatic relations, economic relations, cultural, and defense. And they found that China were way ahead of the U.S. across the 10 countries in the economic category and the diplomatic one, that the cultural was kind of a draw, and that defense was the category in which the U.S. still had an edge. And so I'm thinking about the Shangri-La Dialogue as sort of home turf for the U.S. because it's on the topic where the U.S. is viewed most favorably in this part of the world. And I'm wondering if you kind of agree with that assessment, and if you think that maybe things wouldn't have gone quite so well for the U.S. if this was a conference that was about the economy, for example, and trade.
Yeah, so look, the Lowy Institute's Asia Power Index is a fantastic resource, and I wholeheartedly agree with the metrics on econ and military. I'm a little skeptical of the metrics on diplomacy and kind of cultural cachet, because these are harder to measure, and it's not clear to me that just counting the number of bilateral visits is a good metric for overall diplomatic heft. And I certainly don't think there's much evidence that China has anything approaching U.S. cultural heft. I mean, other than the U.S. and the region, it's clearly Japan and Korea, both of which come out quite good on those metrics on cultural power in the region. But there's no doubt that China is now winning on every economic metric. Trade, bilateral trade in all 10 countries, China's biggest trade partner. I think now net investment flows, they're beating the U.S. in 8 out of 10. They're now the largest development partner, meaning they provide most of the loans and concessionary grants in every country in the region. U.S. still does better on kind of ODA that's top quality, but it's not nearly as much as you can argue, lower quality Chinese development systems. And then that's reflected in every single country in the region, every public and elite opinion poll we have. When people are asked who's the most important economic partner for your country, they say China. And then when you ask who's the most important strategic partner, most still say the U.S. I'll flag this. Our team at the CSIS South Asia program has got a report coming out in the next month that pulls together all of this polling, basically every poll that exists in the region. And what we find is all of that's true, but there's not a clear correlation between the fact that China is by far the most economically important partner and seen that way, and overall opinion toward China. In most of the region, the U.S. remains more popular and the preferred partner. China's economic clout is met with as much anxiety as hope.
So following up on this, and it's really difficult I want to know about President Biden and how he is viewed by these 10 countries. And I know it's really hard. There probably isn't a consensus, but could you kind of get into how President Biden is viewed? Because on the one hand, he's been very strong with defense. He's been very strong in creating a Western alliance for Ukraine. And for us domestically, he's been very strong at protecting democracy. But he's also been, many would argue, objectively horrible when it comes to economic issues like trade. So how does that tension play out overseas, specifically in this region?
President Biden and the Biden administration are undoubtedly more popular than their predecessor. and undoubtedly less popular than the Obama administration was in most of the region. Not all, but most. Now, there's huge gaps in the polling to drive, right? So I do not like it when analysts like go to one country in a region of 700 million people, meet with 20 people and say, here's what Asia thinks. No, that's what the one roundtable you attended thinks. So I want to be cautious here with what we say about public opinion, but it is clear from all the polling we do have that trust in the U.S., when Pew asks, who do you trust to do good in the world, the U.S. has rebounded considerably. But that is held back by the Biden administration's protectionist economic policy. They have no trade agenda. They are engaged in a Trump-light, version of Make in America. The IRA, for all of its support on the climate front, is also seen as an inherently protectionist economic policy that is meant, despite all of our talk about friendshoring, from the perspective of most of our partners in the region, it looks like most U.S. incentives are toward pulling manufacturing back to the U.S., not supporting manufacturing in our allies and partners. And I'll note that in the very last session of the Shangri-La Dialogue, despite being a diplomatic or defense forum, one of the last speakers was Singapore's defense minister, Ng Hen. So, he's the home champ, right? And half his speech was about economics and the refusal of the U.S. to take part in trade liberalization. He referred to U.S. economic policy as nativist economic policy and views that as the biggest threat to regional stability, because the U.S. that is not economically engaged, at the end of the day, is going to continue to lose influence in favor of China.
So the U.S. are not doing trade initiatives, but some of the U.S. partners are, though, right? So we have Japan and Korea and all the other members of the CPTPP who have just been joined by the UK very recently.
Yeah, and China's also bid to join CPTPP.
But what are the prospects for that?
Most of the Southeast Asians, including Singapore, are open to it. They think that it's a net positive. The Aussies and the Japanese are holding the line, but I think they'll say that they can't hold it forever. If it becomes clear that the U.S. is never coming back, then they can't keep the Chinese out.
I'm wondering about how, if we look at just U.S. versus China on economics, we can see that China are ahead. But what would the picture look like if we kind of combined all of the U.S. partner countries and had a real block and looked at the data and tried to figure out who was ahead, the Chinese block or the alternative block?
I'll say this. The government of Japan has been carrying our water for over a decade in Southeast Asia. And it is unreasonable to expect that to continue forever, given Japan's slow economic growth and its demographic decline. Japan punches way above its weight when it comes to trade, investment, ODA. We also have the benefit of the international financial institutions, right? So we are the largest contributors to the World Bank and the ADB, and we have a huge say along with our partners where that money goes. So you could argue that if you combine the multilateral banks, that the U.S. is still actually far and above the largest development partner. You could argue that if you combine the U.S., Japan, Korea, we're probably still the largest net investor, like that coalition. I'm not sure that we'd still be the largest trade partner in most of the region. China is that dominant in many countries. But the other piece of this is, at the end of the day, what matters more, the actual number or what people believe? What people see is made in China signs along bridges and highways, and they see Chinese ambassadors cutting ribbons on the front page of the paper. And it creates a perception, right or wrong, that if you don't embrace this kind of Chinese economic relationship, you're going to miss out. All your neighbors are going to race ahead of you. And so there's a huge political incentive for governments to hedge their bets in order to maintain open economic relations with Beijing.
So the U.S. Trade Representative, Catherine Tai, is widely respected across the political aisle here in the United States Congress, regardless of your ideological persuasion, right? But like you mentioned, it appears there is no overarching trade policy for the Biden administration. From your conversations with folks in the administration, in Congress, who are focused on trade specifically over in Southeast Asia, is there any hope that maybe similar to Obama's second term, that President Biden could embark on a more ambitious trade agenda, maybe re-enter or enter CPTPP in a second term? Is there any hope here, or are we just swaying in the wind aimlessly?
I suspect that in their heart of hearts, the vast majority of officials in the Biden administration working on Asia believe that the U.S. should be in CPTPP, believe that we are damaging our national interests and ultimately our national security by limiting our attractiveness to partners and allies in the region, forcing them into closer relationships with Beijing than they might themselves like. The president still clearly believes in Catherine Tai's vision, and or he legitimately believes that it's impossible to get a trade deal ratified in the U.S. Congress, which I don't think the polling supports. I think that that's wrong, but it's not, clearly it's what the White House believes. After the elections next year, will they feel that they have more space? Maybe. Or will they lay the groundwork for a next administration to reengage with CPTPP? Maybe. I think there's a lot of folks around town who would say that they still believe at the end of the day the U.S. will, because it's so provably the smart thing to do. And at the end of the day, the gravity of it will bring us back in. I'm not sure I'm that sanguine, but I hope they're right.
Just retake the House and then pick off 10 GOP senators or 15 GOP senators,
I would note that there's a lot of GOP senators who are on the record saying that the U.S. needs to be pursuing free trade agreements in Asia. And I think if you spackle them together with moderate Democrats, that's where your majority is. It's not on the wings of either party.
I suppose we've talked quite a bit about economics in a discussion that was built around the defense initiative at the Shangri-La Dialogue. So I want to end the conversation with just a look at the defense mindset in the region. We've addressed how even though the U.S. are concentrating more on the region as a consequence of the U.S.-China strategic competition, there aren't really economic benefits for the countries in the region yet. But we are seeing, like you said, Greg, some of these defense deliverables, new bases in the Philippines and elsewhere. How do the countries in the region really think about this escalating rhetoric between the U.S. and China on defense and security issues? Is it on balance more of a concern that things could turn into a hot war and really disrupt development and peace and security in the region? Or is it seen in some ways as an opportunity to get more commitments for the United States on defense matters?
There was just an interesting poll released by the Eurasia Group, which only polled 3 countries in Asia: Singapore, Korea, and the Philippines. And they actually asked, do you see rising U.S.-China tensions as more of a threat, more of an opportunity, blah, blah, blah. And Singapore was the only place where, I don't remember who the plurality or majority said that we actually see this as useful. We can leverage the 2 great powers. People talk about that a lot. I don't think that's how most people see it. I mean, I think most of the region clearly is primarily anxious. There's kind of a long-term structural fear of China, Chinese revisionism, Chinese aggression. You hear that most in the Philippines and Vietnam, of course, in Japan, Korea, India, to a degree in Indonesia. So clearly kind of the places with most of the people in Asia are more fearful of China and therefore pretty supportive of a continued U.S. presence as a balancer. But then you do have the tactical problem that despite all that, particularly since former Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, there is a sense in parts of the region, some analysts would argue most of the region, I'm not sure I'd go that far, that the U.S. has actually been the greater destabilizer over the last year or so. That by hyping the Taiwan issue, and particularly with Pelosi's visit, the U.S. upsets the status quo. Again, I'm not sure that's actually a majority opinion in the region, but it is a narrative, and it's one that the Biden administration needs to work to tamp down.